November 1940, Toledo, Ohio. The air outside the Willys-Overland plant carried the metallic bite of winter mixed with oil, steel, and tension. Inside, men in grease-stained coveralls moved like ghosts under the white hum of fluorescent lights. Their boots echoed against concrete floors littered with shavings and cigarette butts. No one spoke unless necessary. Every clang of a wrench, every hiss of steam was part of a desperate rhythm. 75 days to create something that didn't yet exist. America was not at war, not officially. But the winds from Europe carried stories. German panzers cutting through Poland, France falling like a sandcastle. The army needed a light reconnaissance vehicle, something that could go anywhere, fast. They called it a general-purpose vehicle, but the concept was vague. 4 wheels, under 1,300 pounds, carry 3 men and a machine gun, climb a 60% grade, and run forever on bad fuel. The kind of dream that sounded like a dare. 3 companies answered that dare: American Bantam, Ford, and Willys-Overland. The War Department gave them 49 days to turn blueprints into reality. Bantam, a small Pennsylvania outfit barely surviving the Depression, delivered first, a strange, boxy little contraption that looked more toy than weapon. But the Army officers who rode it across the test field at Camp Hullabird saw something special. It moved. It didn't care about mud or slopes. It was ugly, but it was alive. At Willys, engineers like Delmar Barney Roos stared at Bantam's design and decided to build something better. They didn't have the luxury of elegance, only time, steel, and stubbornness. Roos designed an engine that would later become legend, the Go Devil. It was loud, strong, and simple enough to be fixed with a hammer and prayer. The Willys team worked through nights, sleeping in corners of the drafting room, hands black with grease, eyes red from caffeine and exhaustion. Ford, ever the giant, watched both smaller competitors with detached confidence. They could build anything: airplanes, trucks, even tanks. But this was different. The challenge wasn't size, it was soul. The Army didn't need another polished vehicle. They needed something that could be dropped from a ship, driven through a swamp, and patched with duct tape and courage. As December approached, Toledo's cold deepened. The plant floor steamed from sweat and heat. Each worker felt the unspoken weight. This machine might decide the next war. The frame took shape. Flat fenders, fold-down windshield, blunt nose. Practicality over pride. When it was done, it looked like nothing the auto world had seen. Small, square, defiant. They called it the Quad. The first morning it was rolled out, the fog clung low over the test field. Engineers lined the track, arms crossed, breath hanging like ghosts. The engine coughed once, twice, then caught. A raw growl filled the air, vibrating through their bones. The headlights flickered to life, slicing through the mist like searchlights. Someone muttered, "Damn thing's alive." The Quad lurched forward, gears grinding, tires biting into cold mud. It climbed the incline, bounced over ruts, splashed through a puddle that froze at the edges. It wasn't pretty, but it was relentless. When it circled back, coated in dirt and glory, even the skeptics stood silent. At the end of the test, a major from the War Department simply nodded and wrote 2 words in his notebook. "It works." No parade, no applause, just the hum of the engine cooling down and the hiss of a cigarette in the snow. But in that moment, something in American industry shifted. It wasn't the roar of a tank or the flash of a fighter plane. It was the birth of a machine that didn't need glory, only purpose. Back inside the plant, Barney Roos leaned over the engine bay, running his hand over the block as if greeting an old friend. Around him, the men had stopped working. Some smiled, some just exhaled for the first time in hours. Nobody said it, but everyone knew they'd done something rare, built hope out of steel and sweat. The next day, an Army officer wired a message to Washington. "Recommend immediate production consideration." Vehicle exceeded expectations. Across the country, other factories stirred. Ford began preparing their version. Bantam protested that their design had been stolen, and Willys pushed forward anyway. There was no time for pride. The world was breaking, and this little box of bolts was about to become its bandage. Outside, snow began to fall over Toledo. Workers filed out, their coats dusted white, their hands still trembling from adrenaline and cold. The factory windows glowed orange behind them, a cathedral of machines. Someone looked back and said, "She'll go places." He was right. Within months, The quad evolved into the Willys MB. Stronger frame, better torque, lower cost. The Army ordered thousands. Each one looked the same. Olive drab, canvas seats, 7 slots in the grille, heart of iron. Soldiers would soon climb into them without thinking. But for now, it was just a prototype. An experiment in motion, a whisper before the storm. In the evenings, when the plant lights dimmed, the last man out sometimes paused by the test track. The tire marks were frozen into the dirt like fingerprints. Proof that something had been born there, something that didn't yet know it was a legend. The following spring, while newspapers filled with headlines from Europe, crates marked Willys MB left Toledo by rail. Each one was a promise on 4 wheels, wrapped in canvas and stamped with numbers no one could yet comprehend. And somewhere on the assembly floor, a worker scribbled on the inside of a Jeep hood before it was shipped. "Good luck, kid. Bring them home." They called it the Quad. No one knew yet that this little machine would help win a world. Across the Atlantic, in a smoke-filled room inside Berlin's Abwehr headquarters, 3 German intelligence officers hunched over a spread of black and white photographs. The pictures had been intercepted from American newspapers and military correspondences, grainy images of an odd little vehicle bouncing through mud, hauling soldiers, towing cannons. One officer, a tall man with a scar that ran from his temple to his jawline, let out a short, dismissive laugh. "No doors. No armor. Primitive construction," he muttered. "Typical Americans. They build toys and call them machines." The others joined in, smirking. They were proud of their own creation. The Kübelwagen. Ferdinand Porsche's design. Precision-born. Air-cooled, rear-engine, engineered like clockwork. To the German eye, the American contraption looked barbaric, a metal box on tractor tires. The arrogance was almost palpable. To them, war was an equation, meticulous, logical, and German. Every bolt had a purpose, every curve a calculation. The Kübelwagen was a soldier's chariot, light yet efficient, designed for roads and discipline. The American Jeep, in contrast, was an insult to design itself. It was too flat, too raw, too unrefined. But what the German officers couldn't see in those photographs was the heartbeat behind that crude frame. The American philosophy that perfection wasn't beauty, it was endurance. While the German engineers obsessed over blueprints and balance, across the ocean, the Americans were obsessed with something simpler: results. In Toledo, Willys engineers were working like men possessed. They didn't talk about form, they talked about function. The Go Devil engine was being refined, 60 horsepower of unpretentious brute force. The hood was flattened for easier stacking on ships. The windshield folded down to make it easier to drop from planes. Every choice was driven by necessity. At Ford's plant in Dearborn, Henry Ford himself took interest, not in the glory of invention, but in the potential of production. "If it moves," he said, "we can make 10,000 of it." His engineers studied the Willys prototype, breaking it down like a puzzle. Soon, Ford's version, the GPW, was on the line, nearly identical but stamped with Ford's signature precision. Meanwhile, American Bantam, the small company that started it all, was fading. Their plant couldn't keep up with military demand. Bureaucrats decided scale mattered more than credit. Bantam's engineers watched in silence as Willys and Ford took the design they had birthed and multiplied it into something unstoppable. It wasn't fair, but war rarely is. In Washington, the War Department didn't care who got the glory. What mattered was speed. Trucks broke down, tanks consumed fuel, horses were history. They needed a vehicle that could climb, swim through mud, and run on faith. And so the contracts rolled in. The production lines roared to life. Thousands of Willys MBS and Ford GPWS began to pour out of factories, each stamped with a serial number that meant nothing now but would someday become a memory engraved in metal. The German High Command received updated intelligence. The first field reports from North Africa described an American reconnaissance vehicle, Open-top, four-wheel drive, capable of traversing sand dunes. Still, the laughter in Berlin continued. "It will choke in the desert," one officer said confidently. "Too heavy, too crude. Not German enough." But in secret, a few engineers weren't laughing. They saw something unnerving. The Americans didn't build one vehicle. They built a system. They could produce 1,000 while Germany struggled to perfect one. That terrified the few who understood the math of war. By the spring of 1942, the Jeep's silhouette was becoming familiar. Short wheelbase, round headlights, vertical grille. Soldiers started calling it Jeep after the cartoon character Eugene the Jeep, known for going anywhere and doing anything. The nickname stuck. Back in Berlin, a young intelligence officer brought new photos, this time of a convoy of Jeeps in a French magazine. Dozens lined up like ants, crossing rivers, hauling supplies. He hesitated before speaking. "Perhaps they are onto something," he said quietly. His superior didn't look up. "The Führer prefers tanks," he said flatly, dismissing the thought. The irony was thick enough to taste. Germany's tanks were magnificent, but they guzzled fuel, broke down often, and demanded precision parts that factories could no longer afford. The Jeep, however, didn't care about beauty or rules. It was ugly, loud, and unstoppable. While German factories built machines for officers, American factories built machines for soldiers. That difference would soon echo through every battlefield. By the summer of 1942, the Jeep had been baptized in training camps from Louisiana to California. Soldiers learned to drive them blindfolded, fix them in the rain, and love them like brothers. They painted names on the hoods: Lucky, Mary Lou, Hellcat. It wasn't a vehicle anymore. It was part of the unit. One soldier wrote home, "It's like having a horse that doesn't eat, doesn't sleep, and never quits." The Go Devil engine roared through American deserts and European snow alike. It didn't need permission, only fuel and willpower. Meanwhile, in Germany, the Kübelwagen rolled along paved roads, elegant but fragile. Its air-cooled engine struggled in deep sand. Its light frame bounced helplessly over rough terrain. And yet, pride kept the Reich blind. When the first American Jeeps arrived in North Africa with the torch landings later that year, the laughter in Berlin died. Reports came in describing these infernal little cars as unstoppable, climbing dunes, hauling men and weapons, slipping through terrain that even tanks refused to touch. But for now, in 1942, the arrogance still held. In one of his journals, a German officer wrote, "Their machine is crude, but perhaps that is its secret. It can break and still run. It is built like their people, loud, persistent, unrefined." He didn't realize it yet, but he had just written the prophecy of defeat. As the year ended, the sound of the Jeep's Go Devil engine became a new kind of thunder, a mechanical heartbeat echoing across oceans. From Washington to London, generals began to recognize its power. It was not just a vehicle, it was mobility incarnate. The Germans mocked it first, but soon the world would run from its sound. The first time the Jeep went to war, it didn't roll onto a parade ground or a red carpet. It rolled off a landing craft into chaos. November 1942, Operation Torch. The dawn sky over the North African coast glowed orange from naval bombardments. The sea hissed against the shore as American troops, many seeing combat for the first time, pushed through surf, clutching rifles and hope. Behind them, lashed down by ropes and tarps, were rows of squat, mud-colored vehicles. Jeeps. When their tires hit sand for the first time, it was like watching a stray dog unleashed. Engines growled, gear levers clunked, sand sprayed in arcs behind spinning wheels. The little machines bounded through dunes, bouncing and coughing, but never stopping. Soldiers shouted, "Move, move, move!" And the Jeeps obeyed like they were alive. In those first hours of war, the Jeep proved what the brochures never could. It didn't care about terrain, weather, or fear. The German Afrika Korps had never seen anything like it. From a distance, they mistook it for a civilian car. Too small, too light. Then they saw it climb dunes their trucks couldn't, crossing soft sand where their prized Kübelwagens bogged down. The Kübelwagen, engineered with elegance, was quiet and efficient on hard ground. But the desert didn't care about elegance. The desert demanded endurance. And the Jeep had it. Day after day, the two philosophies clashed. Not just armies, but ideas of engineering. The Germans relied on precision. The Americans relied on grit. A German lieutenant recorded in his field journal near Tunisia, "We captured 6 American vehicles today. They move like the devil himself. Even damaged, they still crawl forward. We have begun using them ourselves." In the Allied camps, the Jeep became more than a tool. It became a symbol of movement. Generals rode in them, privates drove them, medics turned them into ambulances. They carried stretchers, radio sets, ammunition, food, and even hope. The desert was merciless. Heat waves shimmered over the sand. Engines boiled. Men choked on dust. Supply lines stretched thin across nothingness. But the Jeeps kept running. Soldiers joked that they'd stop the day the earth stopped spinning. Mechanics loved them because they were honest machines. If something broke, you could fix it with a wrench, a rag, and a prayer. No special tools, no delicate systems. Just bolts, metal, and will. One corporal said, "You don't drive a Jeep. You argue with it till it gives in." At night, under a sky filled with tracer fire and stars, Jeeps moved silently in convoys, headlights covered, engines whispering through the dunes. They ferried officers between units, smuggled wounded men to field hospitals, even carried priests giving last rites to dying soldiers. By 1943, the Jeep had earned a reputation. Its silhouette, flat hood, round lights, short frame, was becoming as familiar as a helmet or rifle. It didn't have armor, but it had presence. When soldiers saw one coming through the smoke, they felt relief. It meant help. It meant movement. On the other side of the war, the German Kübelwagens began to feel like relics. They were excellent on roads. But this was not Europe. The desert punished perfection. Its fine-tuned engines clogged with sand. Its air cooling failed under the sun. The Germans started capturing Jeeps whenever they could. They painted them gray, marked them with iron crosses, and drove them proudly. Some German officers even preferred them over their own cars. An intercepted report from a German logistics officer read, "We recommend capturing these vehicles intact. They are far superior in desert performance. Simplicity equals survival." That line, "Simplicity equals survival," became the truth of the Desert War. As the Allied forces pushed westward through Tunisia and Algeria, the Jeep became indispensable. It scouted enemy lines, towed artillery, and chased retreating forces. It wasn't built for speed, but for persistence. The soldiers said it didn't run on gasoline, it ran on grit. There's a photograph from 1943 taken near Kasserine Pass. 3 Jeeps are lined up in the sand, windshields folded down, each one battered, dented, and coated in dust. A mechanic lies beneath one, wrench in hand. Another Jeep's front bumper bears the words, "No hill too high." The men look young, sunburned, and tired, but their eyes carry something fierce, belief. By the time the Germans realized what the Jeep truly was, it was too late. American factories were producing one every 90 seconds. 90 seconds. While Germany's engineers debated design tolerances, America had built another 1,000. That was the secret. Not brilliance, but scale. Not perfection, but perseverance. In a war of attrition, that mattered more than anything. A captured German major, later interrogated by British intelligence, admitted, We thought the Jeep was a toy. Now we think it is the most dangerous weapon the Americans have, because it never stops. The desert had baptized the Jeep with fire, dust, and death. It had carried men into battle and brought them home when the world around them burned. By mid-1943, when the last Axis troops surrendered in North Africa, tens of thousands of Jeeps littered the landscape, some broken, some still idling, waiting for the next road. One American sergeant, leaning against his Jeep, wrote a letter home. "When this is over, I'm buying one. I don't care if I have to build it myself." The desert sun dipped low, casting long shadows over rows of olive-drab Jeeps lined up like soldiers at rest. Their engines clicked softly as they cooled, like hearts catching their breath. That night, as silence returned to the dunes, the legend of the Jeep was already sealed. It wasn't born in a boardroom or a lab. It was born in sand, sweat, and survival. The Germans learned the hard way. Complexity breaks. Simplicity endures. And as the war moved north, through the mountains of Italy and the blood-soaked beaches of France, that little machine was ready to follow. Because once the Jeep started moving, it never stopped. Italy, winter of 1943. Rain fell sideways, turning mountain roads into rivers of mud. Trucks bogged down, tanks spun their tracks uselessly, and mules collapsed under exhaustion. Yet somehow, through this chaos, the Jeeps kept moving, one after another, headlights dimmed, engines grumbling like tired soldiers that refused to quit. The war had changed. The deserts of North Africa were behind them, but the lessons remained. Survival belonged not to the most beautiful machine, but the one that never stopped breathing. American and British troops pushed through the Italian countryside, Salerno, Anzio, Cassino, places that would forever smell of blood and diesel. The Jeep became the lifeline. It wasn't just a vehicle now. It was a stretcher, a messenger, a command post on wheels. Soldiers bolted stretchers to hoods, mounted radios where windshields once folded, and tied ammunition boxes to the sides. You could tell what a Jeep had been through by the dents on its fenders. Each one was a scar, a story. A sergeant named Carl Weaver wrote in his diary near Monte Cassino, "When the trucks couldn't climb, we stripped the Jeep and ran it up the mountain in first gear. We used rope, prayers, and stubbornness. We made it. The boys in the back said they'd rather ride 1 mile in a Jeep than 10 in a truck. Mud caked the tires. Bullet holes peppered the sides. But every morning someone would crank it, and the Go Devil engine would cough, spit, and roar back to life. Even the Germans who once mocked it now hunted it. They captured every Jeep they could get their hands on, repainting them, reusing them, and secretly admiring them." In one intercepted report from a German logistics unit near Rome, an officer noted, "Enemy vehicles, type unknown, are of remarkable capability. Our men prefer them over the Kübelwagen. Recommend capturing intact whenever possible." By mid-1944, German units were so reliant on captured Jeeps that their mechanics received official instruction manuals, translated by field interpreters, on how to repair American engines. But the Jeep wasn't just a workhorse anymore. It was a weapon of deception. During Operation Greif, in the chaos following D-Day, Otto Skorzeny Special Commandos, elite German soldiers fluent in English, disguised themselves in American uniforms, driving real Jeeps they had captured. Their mission: sow confusion behind Allied lines. They painted white stars on the hoods, adopted fake American slang, and rolled through checkpoints with forged maps and confident smiles. The simplicity of the Jeep made it the perfect Trojan horse. It didn't scream enemy. It just blended into the heartbeat of the Allied advance. A British sentry later recalled, "They waved, smiled, and were gone. We thought nothing of it. Every damn soldier was in a Jeep that week." In a cruel twist of irony, the very machine that symbolized freedom became, for a few weeks, a vehicle of sabotage. But even that couldn't tarnish its legend. As the Allies pushed through Italy toward France, the Jeep became a rolling symbol of the American spirit. Humble, fearless, relentless. In photos from that year, you can see them lined up in convoys, canvas tops sagging from rain, wipers slapping at mud. Soldiers grinned from behind the wheel, faces blackened with soot, hands wrapped in rags. Behind them, mountains loomed, and above them, thunder rolled. But the Jeep didn't care. It had one job, to keep going. Then came June 6th, 1944, D-Day, Normandy. At dawn, under a sky filled with gunfire and fear, landing craft crashed against the French coast. The first Jeeps hit the sand seconds after the infantry. Some drowned before they reached shore, swallowed by waves. Others climbed the beach like living things, engines screaming through salt and chaos. In the first hour alone, dozens were destroyed, riddled with bullets or crushed by shells. But more kept coming. Wave after wave, generation after generation of steel willpower on wheels. Photographs from Omaha Beach show a Jeep half buried in wet sand, windshield shattered, a medic crouched beside it, the Red Cross flag fluttering in the wind. The driver's seat is empty. The engine still runs. That sound, the steady, stubborn rhythm of a four-cylinder engine amidst war, became the soundtrack of liberation. Through hedgerows and bombed-out villages, Jeeps carried officers giving orders, engineers building bridges, chaplains holding funerals. In the mud of Normandy, they pulled men from craters, hauled food to front lines, and even served as mobile altars. To soldiers, it became family. One private said, "If you give me my rifle, my helmet, and my Jeep, I can take on the world." Even German prisoners were struck by it. A captured officer near Caen admitted, "We had our Panzers, our Tigers. But your little car, it goes everywhere. It is the cockroach of the battlefield. You cannot kill it." By the end of 1944, the Jeep was in every theater of war. It had climbed Italian peaks, crossed French rivers, and raced across open fields behind retreating Germans. Wherever there was mud, blood, or courage, there was a Jeep. And somewhere in the silence after each battle, one could always hear it. The faint clicking of cooling metal, the quiet reminder of something indestructible. By then, the laughter in Berlin was long gone. They weren't mocking the Jeep anymore. They were hunting it, using it, and trying to build what they could never mass produce. The war had turned, and the tide rolled on four wheels. Berlin, May 1945. The city was a skeleton of what it once was. Smoke still hung over the ruins like ghosts refusing to leave. Streets were filled with silence broken only by the distant creak of twisted metal and the slow roll of rubber tires. Among the wreckage of the Reich, something peculiar moved. Small, dusty, battered vehicles with white stars still faintly visible under grime. Jeeps, captured ones, abandoned ones, survivors. They prowled the streets like relics from another world, carrying officers, prisoners, and refugees. German soldiers who had once sneered at them now drove them through the ashes of their empire. Some painted over the Allied stars with black crosses, others didn't bother. There was no pride left to defend, only survival. A young German lieutenant, retreating eastward from the Soviet advance, wrote in his journal, "We fled Berlin in an American Jeep. We used to laugh at this car. Now it carries us away from the ruins of our dreams." The irony was absolute. The war that had begun with arrogance ended with surrender inside the very machine once mocked. In those final days, the Jeep became the vehicle of peace and paradox. It carried surrendering officers, priests, nurses, and journalists. It ferried messages not of orders, but of silence. The sound of its engine no longer meant attack. It meant that something had survived. When American troops finally stood in the heart of Berlin, they didn't arrive in grand tanks or parading divisions. They came in Jeeps. dusty, dented, bullet-pocked jeeps. The machine of the common soldier had reached the capital of the enemy, and as photographers captured those moments, the stars on the hood glinting against the ruins of the swastika, the symbolism became impossible to ignore. What began as a desperate experiment in Toledo had become the face of victory. In post-war interrogations, German generals were asked what American weapon impressed them most. They expected the answer to be the Sherman tank or the Mustang fighter. Instead, several answered simply, the Jeep. General Heinz Guderian, architect of the Blitzkrieg, admitted, "It is the most useful vehicle ever made. It serves every purpose. We could not replicate it fast enough." Even Ferdinand Porsche, the man behind the Kübelwagen, quietly told a post-war interviewer, "The American Jeep, it was the perfect design for war. Simple, reliable, forgiving. It is what we wished to build, but our philosophy did not allow it." That was the difference. Germany had built machines to dominate. America had built one to endure. When the war ended, factories that once made weapons returned to peace. In Toledo, the Willys-Overland plant stood ready again, its machines still humming from the war effort. Engineers walked through aisles where, months earlier, Jeeps had been assembled by the thousands. Now they would build something else, a civilian version, for a world ready to heal. They called it the CJ-2A, the civilian Jeep. Same body, same Go Devil heart. But this time, it carried plows instead of rifles, children instead of soldiers. Farmers bought them first. They drove them through muddy fields and across snow-covered hills. The same engine that had pulled wounded men from battle now pulled trailers of wheat and hay. War had taught it how to survive anything. Peace taught it how to live. In small American towns, you could hear that same familiar growl, the one that once echoed through deserts and mountains, now bouncing between red barns and grain silos. A mechanic in Kansas said it best, "If it can survive Hitler, it can survive my farm." And survive it did. Willys marketed it proudly. The sun never sets on the Willys Jeep. They weren't wrong. Surplus Jeeps flooded Europe, Asia, Africa. Wherever there were roads to rebuild or fields to plow, they became taxis, ambulances, police cars, and tractors. In some countries, people used them for weddings. In others, for revolutions. Even former German soldiers bought them after the war. The irony was almost divine. Men who once mocked the primitive American box now depended on it to rebuild their shattered world. Years passed, but the silhouette never changed. The flat hood, the 7-slot grille, the round headlights that had once cut through desert fog and Normandy rain. They became timeless, a signature of endurance written in steel. By the 1950s, the Jeep had become more than a machine. It was myth. Movies showed GIs rolling through France. Veterans kept small die-cast models on their shelves. It was the sound of a generation that had seen the world collapse and still found a way to drive forward. Even in peacetime, the Jeep carried that aura of quiet strength. No chrome, no softness, just purpose. You could leave it in a blizzard, dig it out 3 days later, and it would start on the first crank. That was its legacy. Not power, not prestige, resilience. As the decades rolled on, the Jeep evolved into new forms, the CJ, the Wrangler, but the soul never changed. Every curve and bolt still whispered the story of men working through frozen nights in Toledo, of soldiers crossing dunes, of headlights cutting through fog in France. And somewhere, in every garage where one still stands, you can almost hear the echoes of those first words written in a dusty notebook back in 1940. It works. The machine that began as a wartime experiment had become a universal symbol of freedom, endurance, and hope. In a 1965 interview, an old Willys engineer was asked what made the Jeep different from every other vehicle of the war. He smiled and said, "Because it wasn't made for generals. It was made for everyone else." And that was the truth. From the ashes of Berlin to the fields of Ohio, from deserts to farms, from chaos to civilization, the Jeep carried humanity forward 1 mile at a time. Today, when its headlights pierce the dark, there's something almost sacred about it. The light doesn't just illuminate the road ahead. It glows with the memory of every soldier who ever leaned on its hood, every mechanic who ever wiped oil from its block, every family who ever rode home in one when peace returned. It's more than steel. It's legacy. What began as 75 days of desperation in Toledo became a symbol of freedom that outlived every empire that doubted it.